If you are a fan of the horror genre, there is no way you have not heard of the game Outlast. Released in 2013, Outlast became every gamer's worst nightmare. The grotesque imagery and the mysterious and disturbing lore were definitely something, but that is not what made Outlast the phenomenon that it is known as in the gaming community. It was the mechanics that made it impossible for the player to fight back against the several enemies they encounter throughout the gameplay. Can you imagine being chased by killers with only the ability to hide and run away? How terrifying is that? The sound design of these chase sequences, especially in Outlast 1 and 2, was just immaculate. The moment you hear those first few notes, you know you gotta start running as fast as possible. With the Outlast franchise expanding over the years, we decided that it is high time we looked at all the villains and ranked them. So join us as we count down the 10 most terrifying villains of the Outlast lore, with a little someone special at the end. So grab your camcorders, get to the nearest locker, and let's get started. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Eddie Gluskin. Once you see a smile like that, there's no way you would be able to forget it. Edward Eddie Gluskin, more commonly known as the Groom, is bound to terrify you. If that creepy smile and his loving nicknames for you are not enough, his actions will certainly be. Rampant in Outlast Whistleblower, Eddie is a man who is desperate for love. I mean, aren't we all? But Eddie just takes searching for love to a whole new level. Since a perfect partner does not exist, Eddie decided he would make his own perfect partner from scratch. He goes after Waylon, wielding his blade, hoping to turn our poor Waylon into his perfect blushing bride after some much-needed surgical mutilation. While not a lot is known about Gluskin, we can find some documents about him during the gameplay that detail his childhood, and let me tell you guys, it's not good. Eddie was sexually assaulted by his father and uncle when he was a young boy, which led him to suffering a very severe psychotic break. Gluskin comes from a religious household, and his mother, who knew about the abuse, turned the other way. So, to cope with everything that was happening to him, Gluskin used to claim that he grew up in a Leave It to Beaver type of household. Before he was committed to the Mount Massive Asylum, Eddie was a provocative and misogynistic serial killer. He used to seek out women to date, hoping to make them his bride. But the moment the women showed their flaws, his perfect bride's outlook on that woman shattered, and he would murder them soon enough. When he was shown pictures of his crime, Eddie refused to believe that they were dead. He behaved in a similar fashion when he was shown pictures of the abuse he went through when he was a child. But this interview made it clear that despite wanting intimacy and erotic relationships, Eddie has grown uncomfortable with anything like that. After the Murkoff Corporation put him through the experiments, Eddie's mind was completely warped, and he started having delusions of marriage, women, and children. Eventually, the asylum riot began, and that's when Eddie started going after other male inmates to feed his delusions. He caught other variants and put them through vicious, botched sex changes, hoping the procedure would turn them into women and make them his bride. There are two reasons why I believe Eddie is a really scary Outlast villain. For one, in his delusional headspace, he treats the player like a woman, which forces the player to realize the terror and horror of being pursued by a violent guy who just can't take no for an answer, something a lot of women go through every day all over the world. Another reason why Eddie is so scary is the fact that he is a product of his past. If he had been given the right support and the right care when he needed it, he would have turned out differently. He would have healed. He would have become a better person. But the absence of these very needed things turned him into a monster who we can understand. And it is because we understand his plight that his behavior is so horrifying. If only Eddie met the book talk girlies. He would have had a wife or several of them in no time, given how tall, broad, charming, and handsome he is. But for now, since we are in the Outlast world, I'd say please run away when you meet the Groom. The twins. Outlast is truly a game that's the only one of its kind. I don't think any other game has had the gall to literally wave genitalia in your face like Outlast has, especially back in 2013. But here we are with the twins. There is nothing more scary than being chased by two hulking, naked men as they casually discuss how they want to eat your liver and tongue. They show up in Outlast and Outlast 2, and for the most part, they are just leisurely chasing around Miles and Wayland. They are extremely creepy, probably because of how casually they discuss their cannibalistic urges. But overall, when you first meet them, they don't strike you as the worst of the worst, you know? But that is where you guys are wrong, because the twins are extremely smart for variance. Unlike someone else, they don't chatter when they follow you around. Oh no, they sneak up on you without making a single sound. Not only that, but they also know how to check hiding spaces. So yeah, you aren't safe under the bed or in the closet. You just have to be smart and as quiet as possible when you are around the twins, all the while hoping to God you don't get noticed. Now, not a lot is known about their past, but when you initially meet them in the first Outlast game, you can see that these two dudes may have gone through morphogenic engine therapy. They are extremely loyal to Father Martin, the leader of the cult of the Mount Massive Asylum. Despite Father Martin's words and their loyalty, they go after Miles, time and time again, hoping to eat his body parts after murdering him. They are surprisingly good trackers, and even though they give Miles a head start out of courtesy to the father, you can bet your bottom dollar that they are going to be up your ass in no time. However, eventually, when Miles reaches the chapel to witness Father Martin's ritual, the twins are surprisingly docile and do not harm him. So until you reach the chapel to witness Father Martin burning to a crisp, you should probably keep an eye out for the twins. Chris Walker. Outlast was such a major hit amongst the fans because of its absolutely bonkers, completely out there villains. And the first villain, the big bad, if you will, who we see in the game is our big boy Chris Walker. This huge, hulking man with a sinister grin is the stuff of nightmares. Chris Walker is a force to be reckoned with, and every time players come across him, they are completely frozen in fear. And why wouldn't they? The first time we see Chris Walker is when Miles is in the control room and has to hide from him. Miles almost gets caught because Chris searches through the nearby locker, and the whole sequence is just too much. As you play through the game, Chris shows up more and more, and the more he shows up, the more predictable he becomes. Once players figure out that they can simply squeeze through a tiny opening and Chris won't be able to follow them through there, it is a harrowing moment of relief. I am sure a lot of players taunted Chris when they figured it out, because I sure did. But then I had to eat my words when he managed to catch me and throw me down, calling me little pig. Miles's notes about Chris Walker are definitely a delight to read, but if you want to know about Chris in more detail, you have to check out the comics. In there, we learn that Chris was actually hired as a guard for Murkoff Corporation once he returned from military police work in Afghanistan. His stature and strength are absolutely inhumane, but he has a childlike mind. He was a surveillance guard in the Spindletop Psychotherapy Clinic, a Murkoff facility in Texas which specialized in treating veterans with PTSD. However, while in there, Chris was called Strong Fat, which is a diabolical nickname to give someone. The bullying and the questionable Murkoff therapy eventually wore on Chris, and his psyche broke. This led to him murdering 3 of his inmates by ripping them apart. When the Murkoff Corporation got wind of these murders, they sent 2 investigators. They reviewed the surveillance footage and noticed Walker restraining one of the violent inmates in one of the tapes. They found the 4th dead body in the therapy room and figured there would be tapes to identify the culprit. But when they went to the security room, the monitors were smashed. Since the victim and Chris were the only 2 people who could go into this room, the investigators put the pieces together. They went to Chris's home and found 4 cooler boxes. 3 of them had the heads of the 3 bodies bodies that were reported to them. Since the fourth one was empty, the investigators waited for Chris, as he must be coming home soon. They also found that Walker had a stuffed animal, a little pig. Soon after, Walker came home, and despite the investigators' warnings, he did not stand down and attacked. The investigators shot at him, and the bullets scarred his face horribly. One of the investigators was killed, while the other managed to knock Walker out with his car. Since Walker was a Murkoff employee, the murders were blamed on someone else, and Walker was sent off to a secret facility owned by the corporation to be tested on. 2 months later, one of the investigators from his case came to Mount Massive and saw Walker there, all humanity stripped away, turned into the beast that we see rampaging in the first Outlast game. Despite how scary Chris Walker is, I absolutely love the way Miles talks about his death in his note. Chris was ripped apart by the Walrider, rather brutally, if I might add that. To that, Miles said, and I quote, "You've escaped one hell, Chris Walker. God help me, but I somehow hope you didn't find another." Even though Chris Walker has given me nightmares, I do like that. In the end, he has given some dignity after death. Shout out to my boy Miles for being such an OG. Richard Trager. Outlast is full of iconic moments, but the one moment that changed the whole gameplay for me was when Trager was introduced. Up until then, Miles had been running away from Chris. In the midst of all that running, he heard a friendly voice helping him escape. This voice did not sound crazy, so of course, Miles took that help. What happens after that? He is in the hands of Richard Trager, the crazed doctor who wants to use Miles for an experiment. So how did Trager end up in the Mount Massive Asylum? Good question. Trager was actually an executive of the Murkoff Corporation Research Development at Mount Massive Asylum. Then, he became an experimenting surgeon, which Jeremy Blair, the Murkoff executive, did not mind. Out of nowhere, the information about the asylum was leaked. So, of course, investigators were called. When they met Trager, they noticed right away that he was doing too much to ensure everything in his department was fine. So, the female investigator, Pauline, decided to bait Trager. She offered to meet him for dinner at his place, and Trager accepted. During this dinner, Pauline realized that Trager had spiked her scotch with Rohypnol, i.e. a date rape drug. Despite being dizzy, Pauline pulled a gun on Trager and made him drink the scotch. Trager passed out, and on searching, Pauline found the pamphlet of an abortion clinic in his house. Soon enough, Pauline and her partner, Paul, figure out the true nature of this man. He assaulted one of the women on his team and threatened her to get an abortion by holding her job over her head. Out of desperation, the woman leaked information, hoping that would lead to Trager getting fired. Paul and Pauline got the woman a severance package and bought her silence. Later, when the woman showed up at Blair's office to get her security clearance cleared, Trager attacked her with a pair of scissors, stabbing her multiple times in the stomach. Pauline and Paul immediately jumped into action, and while tackling Trager, his long hair got caught in a paper shredder and scalped him brutally. Even though Blair was Trager's friend, he personally oversaw Trager being put into the morphogenic engine. Armed with a pair of shears, Trager straps Miles to a chair and cuts off 2 of his fingers, leaving both us and Miles pretty shocked. Richard Trager is the living example of how there is no friend in hell, and the players have to figure out how to escape Trager's domain before he manages to slice them up even more. Eventually, Trager is turned into Trager juice when Miles gets into the elevator, and Trager tries to climb in, only to end up getting pulled headfirst in between the platforms, crushing him completely. Marta. Look, we have all thirsted over Lady Dimitrescu. Who doesn't want a tall, murderous woman to chase them? I do, but that is only when it comes to the Resident Evil franchise. As far as Outlast is concerned, the only tall woman on a murder spree is Marta, and I sure don't want her after me. Dressed in dark robes and wielding a huge pickaxe, Marta is the most feared member of the Testament of the New Ezekiel that we are introduced to in Outlast 2. Sullivan Noth, the founder of this testament, molded Marta into a murderer by claiming she would be a sinner if she did not kill the people who could hurt the community. Her undying devotion to Noth turned her into a huntress over time. Set in Temple Gate, which which looks like a village surrounded by forests, Marta's first appearance is always iconic and absolutely spine-chilling. No matter how hard Blake tries to evade her, no matter how fast he runs, Marta is always 2 steps behind him, waiting to pounce on him. Maybe Marta graduated from the Michael Myers school of walking behind running characters and still catching up to them. The entire game, Marta is a huge nuisance. Every time you hear mutterings of the gospel, you know it is time to start running away, because here's Marta coming to get you. Despite her terrifying screen presence, I have a pet peeve about Marta. In Outlast 1, all the villains we face off against die in a way that feels satisfying. Chris Walker getting ripped open by the Wall Rider, or Trager getting smushed. Both deaths are so iconic and memorable. Miles does not actively cause death, but it happens because of his actions or just bad timing on the villain's part. But when it comes to Marta, her death just does not feel satisfactory. I mean, yes, it is ironic that she dies getting impaled by the metal cross, but it just feels a lot like divine intervention. I just feel like Marta should have gotten an iconic death like Walker, you know? But you and I, we both know that if I were truly in Blake's place, I would have been happy as a clam seeing Marta get impaled the way she did. Frank Manera. In Outlast 1, we had Chris Walker. In Outlast 2, we got Frank Manera. The first time we come across Manera, he is happily working in the kitchen, slicing and dicing. What, you thought he was cooking vegetables? Oh, no. He is, in fact, cooking a Murkoff employee. He wields a buzzsaw and just loves eating all his victims. Looking into his files, we get to learn that Frank Antonio Manera, born in 1976, was admitted to the asylum when he was 36 years old. Ever since his arrival at the asylum, Manera started losing a lot of weight. He simply would not eat. He refused any food and water and even stopped grooming himself, but no one knew why. This kept happening for 2 years, up until 2012 when Frank actually came clean. No, he did not come clean out of his own volition. He was taken to the morphogenic engine, and his dark secret was kinda ripped out of him. After his experience with the morphogenic engine, Frank became one of the most dangerous variants in the Mount Massive Asylum. He often attacked other variants, regardless of their strength, and if they were defeated, Frank would gladly make a meal out of his victims. It was said that Frank also liked drinking the blood of his victims directly from their chests. Talking about drinking the forbidden Kool-Aid. In Whistleblower, when Wayland meets Frank, Manera has already killed a bunch of guards and is chomping down on a doctor. He obviously figures out there is fresh meat around, that is, Wayland himself. So off he goes, chasing Wayland down with a circular saw. He did manage to get Wayland at one point, and that was enough to fill me with fear. But then, he decides to barbecue Wayland in the furnace instead, which gives him the opportunity to run away from Manera. While we do not see Manera again, I'm pretty sure he survived when the contractors stormed in to contain the situation. Manera was locked in the recreation block, which was isolated from the main building, so I would not be surprised if we see him once again when we return to Mount Massive. Lars Byron. Lars Byron is another villain we come across when Blake is looking for Lynn at Temple Gate. He, just like Marta, is a part of the Testament of the New Ezekiel. However, he is a dwarf, and at some point had to get his legs amputated because of some unforeseen circumstances which rendered him unable to walk. To make up for that, we see him riding on the shoulder of his trusted servant, Nick Tremblay. You could say that Laird is the brains while Nick is the muscles of this duo. Laird is the leader of the Scald, the twisted and sick part of the Testament. His main job is to keep the deformed part of the group out of Noth's territory, which is the Temple Gate village. He is a devout follower of Noth and seems completely willing to lay down his life for Noth's twisted goals. In return, Noth keeps correspondence with Laird via letters and sometimes sends him and his followers some food. Laird goes after Blake as he believes Blake is the new Messiah Messiah once the latter escapes from Temple Gate. He and Nick crucify Blake at one point, hoping to help him ascend. Then, after Blake had suffered the same fate as Jesus, they would bury the corpse and eventually unearth it, only to eat it. Laird was willing to do all of that because they believed by eating the Messiah's flesh, they would be able to heal their deformities. However, Blake was not about to become the Messiah and made a run for it, but he got caught again, and this time, Laird buried him in a coffin. While this sequence is pretty exciting from a gamer's perspective, when Blake escapes the coffin, we find out that Laird buried us under 1.5 inches of dirt. Brushing off that disappointment and dirt, Blake makes a run for it again when Laird spots him. Laird first assumes that Blake has gone through the resurrection, but when reality sinks in, he attacks Blake with arrows. He tries to send his men, the Scald, after Blake, but given his abusive treatment towards his men, 2 of them betray him instead. They push Laird and Nick, who fall onto a wooden dock, dying pretty brutally. Father Loudermilch. Father Loudermilch, introduced in the second Outlast game, may not be one of those variants that were experimented on, but that does not make him any less of a monster. In fact, I would go out on a limb and say that he is one of the most vile villains of the series. We meet Father Loudermilch in the school section of the Outlast 2 game, set before the events of the 2 games. Throughout the gameplay, we see Blake having flashbacks to his school days. Father Loudermilch was the music teacher at St. Sybil High School. Whenever we see him, he is seen talking to Blake, sometimes singing and even laughing and taunting Blake. In his school hallucinations, we see Blake envisioning Father Loudermilch as this demonic entity with what seems to be a sentient tongue which keeps grabbing at him. On the surface, it seems like the father was this calm, well-spoken man of God. But as we go through the notes we find, we realize he was worse than the devil himself. He abused his power to paint Jessica Gray, Blake's friend, to come off as a problematic child. To prove his friend's innocence, Blake brought a camcorder to school hoping to get evidence. In these twisted recordings, we find out that Father Loudermilch is one of those people who just love children way too much. And all of this love he had was directed towards Jessica. He had become obsessed with Jessica, and it is clear that he had been trying to woo the child for a while. He caught Blake and Jessica in school and used his authority to scare Blake away. Even though Blake knew something was wrong, he left, and later he heard Jessica's screams, which led to him finding her corpse at the staircase. It was claimed that Jessica hung herself in one of the classrooms, which we now know was a big fat lie. It is heavily implied that Father Loudermilch scared Blake into covering up the crime, which affected him for the rest of his life. Sullivan Noth. Introduced in Outlast 2, Sullivan Noth is the crazy mastermind who created the Testament of the New Ezekiel, which is a cult of Christian fanatics. Born in 1933, Noth actually grew up to be a shoe salesman in Albuquerque, New Mexico. However, he was burdened with a bunch of debts and was about to lose his home. With no other choice, he started listening to an evangelical radio station, hoping that would bring him some comfort. While he did not find any comfort there, Noth soon started hearing a different voice from the radio, claiming to be God. This God told Noth to change the religious, spiritual condition of the earth with a new prophet. Sullivan believed himself to be this chosen prophet, and soon after, he had a vision of a terrible creature. He was told that the apocalypse was near, and it was his job to lead a group of chosen few into paradise. This became Sullivan's new calling, and he started preaching to the people of Albuquerque. As religious fanaticism usually goes, he soon had a bunch of fanatically dedicated followers, and with them, he formed the Testament of the New Ezekiel. Eventually, Noth was given a vision of the village of the Temple Gate after he cut out his left eye for God. Seeing the vision, Noth took his men and went deep into the wilderness of Arizona and named the settlement Temple Gate, founded in 1971, 5 years after Noth started listening to the radio. Like most cult leaders, Noth is able to command his men in an almost hypnotic way, forcing them to do whatever he wishes, even if it means doing the most vile thing on the planet. He constantly abuses his powers over his followers for his agenda. He also forces the women in his cult to get pregnant as frequently as possible so that he could kill the children and prevent the end of days. He truly believes, deep down, that whatever he is doing is for the best. As we soon find out, Sullivan kidnapped Blake's wife, Lynn, assuming she is the one who has the Antichrist that would bring the end of days. Lynn does give birth to her baby, but she passes away from the blood loss. Blake lost his consciousness after his wife died in his arms. When he woke up, he found Sullivan Noth next to him. In fact, Noth tried to manipulate Blake into killing his child. When that did not work, Noth ended up slicing his own throat almost in a trance. We see him shocked at what he had done and trying to stop the bleeding, but it was too late and Sullivan died. In the Murkoff account, we find out that all of the people at Temple Gate, including Noth, were manipulated by the excellent transmission of the morphogenic engine. So in a way, Outlast 2 is based on 5G tower-induced delusions. Certainly not the most horrifying ordeal I have heard about. Leland Coil. One of the more recent games of the Outlast series is the Outlast Trials, and this is where we are introduced to Leland Coil. He is a corrupt police officer who really wants to punish the undesirable or the helpless people. The Murkoff Corporation obviously decided that he would be the perfect fit for their organization, and sure enough, he joined their company as one of the prime assets. Coil loves electrocuting and assaulting his test subjects with his baton, which is just so sadistic. He is completely psychotic, and we often see him speaking in a weird, Wild West jargon. His depravity knows no bounds, and both male and female reagents are a part of his victim list. If you don't know who the reagents are, they are poor people who volunteer to be subjects of Murkoff correction in exchange for money during the Cold War. To be honest, Leland just sounds a lot like Brother Love. Even though Leland is actually an ex-Marine, he upholds none of that pride. He has always been a villainous man, and in Outlast Trials, that shines brighter than a diamond. His past also reveals his tie-ups with racist organizations, something I saw coming from a mile away. As a player, if you ever come across Leland Coil, the best thing you can do is run as fast as you can, because unless you lose him, Coil is going to get you, and that's pretty much worse than death. Honorable mentions. While we decided to expand upon these 10 villains from Outlast, that does not mean we don't have more villains in the series. We have Skinner Man, the relentless pursuer of the reagents who loves draining his victims' vitality with an AoE aura that would affect everyone around it. We have Jeremy Blair, the disgustingly immoral person who runs all of these experiments under Murkoff Corporation. He is willing to play as dirty as it can get if it means he can keep all the company's secrets hidden. He is a vile human being for treating other human lives like cattle. We also have the Pouncer, Dennis, Mother Gooseberry, Night Hunter, Val, and many more. It is clear that the writers genuinely enjoyed creating these villains, and the sheer amount of thought having been put behind each character. If you guys would like a part 2 of this video discussing the other villains in detail, let us know down in the comments. Marvelous verdict. The Outlast series is an extremely memorable ride. It has a way of getting under your skin in ways no other game can. Each villain of this series is carefully crafted, almost showcasing the most vile sides of every man's psyche. And as a horror fan, this is truly amazing. The psychological horror portrayed through each villain of this series makes you wonder how a human could ever be capable of doing these things without feeling any guilt. With such unforgettable villains, Outlast is a game that has made its mark in the horror genre. And with how actively Red Barrels is working to pump more games out, I'm curious to see how the Outlast lore gets expanded. Let us know in the comments which villains you would like us to cover next. Until next time, stay safe out there and don't run out of batteries.